on Plugged In, Stateless and Displaced. On World Refugee Day, a snapshot of the global refugee crisis, from northwestern Kenya to the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, and from war-torn Syria to the troubled borders of Venezuela. Over 70 million humans on the move or fleeing for their lives. What can the international community do to ease the plight of the world's stateless and displaced? Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Patsy Widakuswara, filling in for Greta Van Susteren. 70 million. That number represents the entire population of France. It's also the number of people who have been forced to flee their homes because of war, famine, violence, or any number of human rights abuses that force people to take that last step to leave their own countries and seek refuge elsewhere. World Refugee Day gives us an opportunity to focus attention on the stories of people who have no place to call home due to circumstances beyond their control. VOA's Skylar Ogden has more.
Majed Abdelrahim, known as Chef Majed, cooks Syrian food in Washington, D.C. The smell of spices reminds him of the shawarma houses in Damascus, but he probably will never go back.
I left Syria in 2013, February. I left to Jordan because my father and my mother, he told me, please leave Syria because Syria too much war and not safety.
Majed is one of 25 million refugees around the world. Another 70 million people have been forced from their homes because of persecution, rights abuses, conflict, and violence.
And the numbers that we're seeing in 2018 now are the highest we've ever seen.
Like the hundreds of thousands of Rohingya who were forced to leave Burma and flee into neighboring Bangladesh.
They put petrol and then burn your house. So what you do? You have to save your life. You don't have nothing. Your house burned down and you don't have nothing. So what should you do? If the government's against you, where you want to go?
Many languish in camps with no idea when or if they can return home. In the Americas, another mass exodus in Venezuela, where the political and economic conditions are extremely dire. And in Central America, a dramatic increase in gang violence in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador has fueled migration northward. Refugee officials say older conflicts in Africa and South Asia continue to aggravate the problem.
There are still people fleeing violence and persecution in Afghanistan and getting anywhere they can get to find safe ground and a measure of protection and safety so that they can begin to rebuild their lives and to get their lives and their families' lives back on track. Afghanistan is one example of a situation. There is still a situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa where there are parts of that country that are afflicted by very serious violence.
Refugees in the top host countries, including Uganda, Pakistan, and Turkey, live in harsh conditions, and their status is tenuous. Very few countries offer resettlement. The UN Refugee Agency says the U.S. remains one of the world's largest resettlement countries. This refugee, who asked not to be identified, says he has no plans to return to his homeland.
I would be scared to go back to Yemen. For me, as a gay man, it's just not a place for me I want to be at. It is illegal to be gay in Yemen. The penalty for that is death, actually.
In December, the United Nations adopted the Global Compact on Refugees to strengthen the global response to the refugee problem.
Refugees are never asking just for handouts. They're asking for a hand up so they can rebuild their own lives.
That's exactly what Chef Majed has done in America.
In 2017, February, I moved to DC, work, and I live in Maryland with my family. My life now, my plan, I am here in America. I want work here in America and I complete my life here in America. But I want to make good future for my family.
For VOA News, I'm Skylar Ogden.
Getting to America is a goal of many refugees, but new policies by the Trump administration are slowing that flow. Ceiling set by the U.S. government on the number of refugees resettled has dropped from the 85,000 in the last year of Barack Obama's presidency to 30,000 this year. And the number of actual resettlements was well below the ceiling in 2018, with a similar trend so far in 2019. Alini Barros is a reporter for VOA's Immigration Beat. She has been following U.S. policy on immigration, migration, asylum, and refugee status. So we will start there. Thank you so much for joining us, Alini. Let's start with the basic. What is the difference between refugee and asylum seeker?
So there are significant differences, right? Like as a refugee, you are usually forced to flee your home, often without any sort of notice. You have to go to a host country. You have to prove that you qualify for refugee status, because you have to prove that you have some sort of fear of persecution, right? Usually happens during war or any sort of government persecution. You have to go through the UN, the United Nations agency responsible for refugees. You don't choose where you go. You go through the first vetting through UN. So the UN refugee agency will then follow up with countries who are willing to take you and your family and their priorities. So you go through all this process, and it takes quite some time. One of the families that we've interviewed in our stories, they were waiting about 5 years in the refugee camp. So it doesn't happen overnight. But once you get to, let's say, the U.S., you have authorization to come here. You receive humanitarian aid, you are able to work. And then you go through the process of getting your work permit, right. And there are people helping you. So there's all those different
sorts of process
exactly.
for refugees. And for asylum seekers?
So for asylum seekers, you have to be in the U.S., in the U.S. case, you have to be in U.S. territory in order to ask for help. You have
whatever the country that you want to be in.
Exactly,
right, yeah.
But you have to ask for help. And right now we have people at the border, but you also can have a visa. Let's say some of the people that I've interviewed, they've had visas. As soon as you get to the airport, people will say, I am running away from government persecution, I'm running away from gang recruitment, I'm running away from something, and they will explain what it is. And that's when you say, I need help.
So the difference is where you apply, whether from outside the country or within the country.
Exactly.
And how does that matter in terms of just like legal protection, for example?
So as an asylum seeker, you're not able to work, right? You don't get none of the humanitarian aid. You have nonprofits helping you out. So it's a much more complex process to go through the asylum process, and it can take way longer because you are going in front of an immigration judge, right, and potentially explaining some horrific things,
right?
Yeah. So from both cases, once you get to the moment where your application is approved, then it's pretty similar. You're able to prove that you have a fear of persecution, then you get your green card. It takes time,
right?
But then after that, after your application is approved, then it's pretty similar.
What about the context of migrants and immigrants?
So those are the two terms that people used a lot. A migrant can be someone coming, let's say, from one of the Central America countries, and they will stop in different countries until they get to the U.S., right? Not every migrant will be an asylum seeker. Some of them cannot prove, they cannot show the proof needed to, establish fear. An immigrant, usually someone who, come here with a visa, they want to settle here for economical reasons. They made a choice to move out of their country and get here.
So this is a big question to ask with a little time to discuss it, right? Everybody in the U.S. said that they want immigration reform. What is the biggest hurdle to overcome that? Is it the ideological divide between Republicans and Democrats who say that they want to solve the immigration problem, but they don't see the problem as the same problem?
Yeah, that is something that in our beat we usually say that we don't see anything coming out anytime soon. I will tell you this. Democrats, they are more into, reuniting family, not so much open borders, but making it easier for people to come here to work and find new opportunities. Republicans want the merit, based immigration, and they sort of talk a little bit about the Canadian immigration model. So they're very different. So you still have dreamers and DACA recipients and TPS holders. So there's so many little things within immigration that needs reform that I really don't see happening anytime soon.
And it's very difficult to get anything done when the people on both sides of the aisle don't even see the problem as the same, right?
Exactly.
And so in the next coming months, we'll just have to continue to see what's going to happen. But what are some of the things that we can look forward to?
Look, today we may have a Supreme Court Census 2020 ruling. We don't know what's going to happen with the potential DREAM Act, if that's still going to be called DREAM Act. TPS holders are also waiting to hear. But it's one of those things, right? Like if you do something for one group of people, you have to do for something else for other people, you know?
Yeah.
So that is the problem.
Thank you so much, Alini, for your very insightful discussion. Just in 2018, more than 13 million people were forcibly displaced due to conflict or persecution. Almost 80% were displaced within their own home country. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees keeps track of how many refugees there are and where they go. Ninette Kelly is the director of the UNHCR's New York office. She explained the findings of a new report that estimates the number of refugees worldwide at more than 70 million.
It's important, I think, to put that number in perspective because there's a great saying that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And that's what we face when we're trying to communicate these numbers and what they mean. But 70 million is like the population of France or of Thailand. It's twice the population of the country I come from, Canada. And every single figure represents a human life of great suffering and loss. Every refugee you talk to will tell you that leaving home and leaving their country is the last desperate act after a chain of unimaginable hardship. The top 2/3 of the refugee population are coming from and have consistently come over the last several years from 5 countries. That's been Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. And when you look at those countries, you can see that both Afghanistan and Somalia have had reoccurring displacement for over 40 years. 2/3 of all refugees in the world, the vast majority, are hosted by neighboring countries. That's true everywhere you look. So if you look at our largest refugee situation, which is the Syria crisis, it's Turkey, it's Lebanon, it's Jordan that are bearing the disproportionate load in terms of providing safety and security for these people. I think the most dramatic change really has been in terms of asylum seekers and mass movement has been out of Venezuela and what it's meant to the countries in the region. Colombia now has over 1.3 million registered Venezuelans. Peru is up to over, I think today it's close to 800,000, followed by, every country in that region is touched, Argentina, Ecuador, Brazil. And we've seen an amazing swell of solidarity and assistance from these countries, but they're also very much stretched, and we haven't seen the appeals for assistance that they need and for humanitarian assistance being met at the pace that we need. The situation has been developing over many years in the Northern Triangle, in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras. And what you can read in the reports, what we know from the people that we interview, what we witness in our programs on the ground, in our discussions with the government, is these are countries that are having a real struggle in terms of law and order within their own countries. There are very gripping accounts of situations where neighborhoods are controlled by rival gangs, and where the choice for a young male is you either join a gang and murder others or you be murdered yourself. And for a young woman can be conscripted into, trafficking and sexual abuse. And so the problems in that region very much demand a focus on addressing the root causes of that. And what we're seeing in terms of people fleeing is, again, it's a last gasp, desperate effort to save themselves.
A photo of a father and daughter who drowned trying to get to the United States is adding fuel to an already heated debate about immigration. The photo shows the pair lying face down, washed up along the banks of the Rio Grande, separating the U.S. and Mexico. Thousands more are lining up at the border seeking entry, legally or illegally, into the U.S. VOA's Celia Mendoza has covered this issue from both sides of the border. She joins us from Osaka, Japan, where she's covering the G20 summit. Celia, let's start with the G20. These countries are not only the strongest economies, but also at the center of the global migration governance. How much focus is the G20 giving to the issue of migration this year?
Patsy, openly is not in the agenda, however, is one of the most important topics in terms of what the United States has been doing using the tariffs as well as their economic policies to drive immigration policies between the United States and those countries where most of those migrants are coming from. And that is something that will be permeated into the talks here at the G20. Something that is particular is the absence of the president of Mexico. The president of Mexico just recently got a deal with the United States after a threat of using tariffs to try to get more efforts in the part of Mexico to stop the undocumented migration into the United States, and we have seen results. And Mexicans are very worried of why the president of Mexico is not coming to this event to try to drive their message, to try to explain why it's important to have the commerce that they have right now, to try to get to a solution that is long-term with the countries that are on the top 20 economies of the world. But it's something that is clear during the talks that we have seen here is the economy and migration is something that every time is closer together. The United Nations have said it. The Secretary General has made a call to the countries here at the G20 to remember migration and the importance for that subject to be touched, but also to be understood by these countries and the impact it has in their economies.
So, Celia, are there different sides? You mentioned Mexico and the U.S., but are there, clear different sides on the migration debate between the leaders there in terms of how they approach the world's migration problem?
Definitely. We have seen how the president of the United States have changed completely how the United States stands in terms of migration, how is more protective of the borders in terms of not allowing as many people as coming into the United States. But we have seen an effort by Germany, for example, France, to try to establish policies that are open. Canada, for example, is another country that has opened their borders and has taken more refugees, especially those coming from the Middle East, Syria, and other countries that are in crisis for years. And that this is something that we have seen as a difference between the United States and countries that are usually aligned with the positions of the United States. And that is permeating into these discussions. Something else that we have seen is the positions of countries like China and Russia. They have not been very open to migration, but they're very aware of what is happening in the world and are trying to get involved in some of the questions that are now presenting the migration in terms of security issues, as well as how the United States is treating countries like, for example, Venezuela, where Russia and China are very active in terms of trying to give humanitarian aid, as they have said they're doing, but the United States has criticized that intervention into those countries that they believe is just not a position that should be taken by countries that are not in the region. So we have seen how different it is, the position by the countries, and how they're trying to adjust to this new order.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Venezuela, and I want to go a little bit more into that. You've recently covered the situation there. You've traveled to the border between Venezuela and Brazil and Venezuela and Colombia, where there was a standoff between Juan Guaido trying to bring in humanitarian aid, and between their forces and Maduro forces. Share with us that experience.
Well, definitely is something that it has changed the region. I'm a Colombian born, and I understand the migration that Colombia had during the violence inside the country, but this is completely different. We have seen a ton of people leaving Venezuela. Since 2015, the number, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency, is more than 3 million Venezuelans that have left the country. During the standoff, we saw the tension inside the country, but also in the borders. Nicolas Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, closed the border between Colombia and Brazil, as well as with Venezuela. And that is an example of how difficult it is and how tense is the situation. People were risking their lives to try to escape Venezuela and pass through whatever places they were able to pass through to make it to Colombia or either to Brazil. Now, what we have seen also is the lack of opportunities to be able to get access to food and medicines, and that is why it was so important to get humanitarian aid. However, it was not successful and generated more issues for Venezuelans that were on the border, but as well as those that were in Venezuela and were not able to freely come between the two countries. So we have seen a lot of tension, and that is something that continues, even though the president of Venezuela opened the doors for the Red Cross, and they're trying to make some adjustments. But even then, the numbers keep growing according to the United Nations.
Yes, and there's also concern that President Trump is losing interest in the Venezuela situation. I want to move closer to the U.S., to the border between U.S. and Mexico, where you've also covered. You went to Juarez. What was it like there?
Patsy, something that we saw is the emotion and the tension that you can feel in the border, especially because now Mexico is patrolling with the National Guard the border between El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez. We went to a shelter where Cubans are waiting to go into the United States or ask for asylum, but they were very worried because they have had other Cubans as well as Central Americans who came into the United States. They gave themselves up. They were in detention, got their order to go to court, and were sent back to Mexico to wait for their processes. This is something that was agreed between Mexico and the United States, and is happening. And that is generating a lot of fear, as well as disillusion by some of those people that believe that they should be in the United States, waiting for their asylum. And also they believe that Mexico is not a safe country, and that is why they're very concerned. They're asking the government of the United States to listen to their pleas. But as we know, right now, the administration is very clear that those that cross into the United States have to wait in Mexico for their asylums. And for these people means that they will not be able to earn any money in Mexico, as they cannot work as they wait for their processes.
Celia Mendoza, VOA Spanish Service, thank you. We appreciate your reporting. It's not just migrants from Mexico and Central America who are trying to enter the United States. U.S. border officials say the list also includes African migrants. The number of African migrants apprehended by U.S. border officials has spiked from a total of less than 100 in past years to more than 600 in just the last few weeks. They are part of a small but increasing number of migrants from countries other than Mexico and in Central America who cross into the southern United States without authorization. The question is, why are African migrants, some of them refugees, trying to come in through the Mexican border? Roger Montu has been covering the story for us. He's a host of a popular radio and weekly TV show for VOA's French to Africa service. Thank you for joining us, Roger.
Thank you, Patsy.
So tell me first, who are these people, the people who are trying to cross into the U.S.?
Now, Patsy, as you said, well, for months we knew that the southwest border was packed with Central Americans who were crossing the borders in breaking, record-breaking numbers. But lately we see, as you said, the Africans who are also coming. Now we know that most of them are coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola, which is in Central Africa.
So these are Francophiles?
There's a Francophone, and of course, the other one speaks Portuguese in Angola, of course, right.
So we'll talk about why they're fleeing these two countries, but do you have any idea where they're going once they get to the United States?
No, once they get to the United States, for those, according to those who I spoke with, they're going to different states, but mainly they're going to New York, but the larger number are going to Portland.
Portland?
Yes.
Why Portland?
Exactly. I spoke to the president of the Congolese community in Portland, Mr. Bongiba, who told me that the mayor of Portland, Maine, Ethan Streamling, with his local government, they have been working hard in order to help these migrants who are coming in their state. They are definitely making sure that once they get in the state, they have a place to stay. They have they can get their feet on quickly in order to not only take care of their families, but also to contribute to the economy of Portland.
So that's really interesting how states organize or how states treat migrants, make a big difference in terms of migration, migrant patterns, right? So We talked about them coming in from Congo and Angola. We know that there's violence there, but is there something in particular about this year that's making them, move in bigger numbers?
Exactly, Patsy, because what happened is we know that according to the UN, the United Nations, an average of 6 migrants die each year, right? Each year, trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea and the Sahara Desert. So this has been going on. This is what the migrants have been talking among them. So they now think that not only, well, first of all, let's say that path from Africa to Europe is shorter than the longer path that they're taking now, crossing, going to Brazil, and then coming up north. But they rather be safe. They don't care about the longer way that it takes, the longer path that it takes. But according to them, so many people have been killed and dying on the way trying to reach Europe, and especially between that, trying to cross the last step, which is Libya to Italy.
The
space.
crossing,
exactly.
yeah.
It's
so
just,
they're actually thinking that it is safer and easier to go all the way to the U.S., starting from Brazil, rather than make the shorter distance to Europe.
Exactly.
And that is causing the increase?
So they think, they're telling me not that it's easier, but a little bit easier because they still have to cross. It's a month, long trip crossing from Brazil to the southern border of the United States of America. And also, they also mentioned, Patsy, that the good thing is that when they get here, city officials, religious NGOs are taking care of them better than they take care of them in Europe.
So there's a change in migration pattern from Europe to the U.S.
Correct.
Does the fact that some of these nations in Europe are cracking down on the migrant, does that also give them more pressure to go elsewhere?
Exactly. Again, because they are mentioning how U.S. officials are more open in order to let them come in the country and to listen to them, give them the opportunity to listen to them before either deporting them or giving them asylum.
I can only imagine the kind of things that these people are going through because they're actually doing this. And of course, they're hearing the news about what's happening in the U.S.-Mexico border. So tell me about some of the stories of desperation that you're
some
hearing.
of the story of desperation, Patsy, it's what really impressed me on this story is that you find people who are coming single, a man who's coming by himself, and then you have a mother who's coming with 2 or 3 kids. Of course, when they get to the borders, the mother and the kids are more likely to be let in first, and they'll quickly deport the single man, who's coming, or they'll be willing to help quickly the mother. But now what they're doing, Patsy, is when they get there, they are getting, trying to get together before they enter the United States. Look, just why don't I be your husband? Tell them I'm your husband so I can belong to this family, so I can also enter the United States. This to me was just mind-blowing that they'll do everything to enter the borders.
Roger Mutu, thank you so much. We appreciate
Thank you so much,
reporting.
Patsy, for having me.
Well, that's all the time that we have today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. Please like our Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta or follow her on Twitter at Greta. Also, follow me at Twitter at P. Widakuswara. We leave you now with a photo essay on the plight of refugees around the world. Thank you for being plugged in.
Thank you.